8 people floated down the Euphrates River and came out of the canyons of the mountains of Ararat onto a plain. Now we want to see what happened in the early years, while they were still living in the central area of the Fertile Crescent. They undoubtedly brought some of the animals down the river with them, but they would have needed another ark to bring them all down. The birds flew away. At least one of every clean animal was offered as a sacrifice. Since Noah brought 7 of all the clean animals on the ark, that left 6 rabbits to multiply like rabbits do. We know from excavations that sheep, goats, deer, gazelles were abundant. Pigs and cattle too. Some animals were domesticated. Many others had to be released into the wild. They could have been kept close to the settlement by using feeders, but they probably weren't seen again until they became abundant. Fish were abundant in all the oceans and lakes. What about plants? According to Genesis 6:21, God told Noah to take every sort of edible plant into the ark for food. One fictional story tells the tale that Noah's wife traveled around the globe to collect every species of plant in order to save them alive. Plants, however, didn't need saving because they floated in the water outside the ark and immediately sprang up. It took a while for forests to replace grasslands. What about people? How would a handful of people have survived all alone in a huge unknown world? Actually, pretty well. The Bible and archaeology work together to tell us much about the early years. The Table of Nations in Genesis 10 gives us 70 names of prehistoric leaders. This is valuable information we can use. 16 men from the first generation became the heads of tribes that developed into nations. 36 tribal leaders were born in the second generation, more than double the first generation. That means that world leaders grew up together and played together. No wonder they worked together so peacefully. Writers such as Ken Johnson have attempted to link the Table of Nations to historic nations. Some parts are credible and others are based on legends. Let me give you one example. Javan and Elisha are listed in Genesis 10 as the son and grandson of Japheth, who was the son of Noah. These seem to match the father and grandfather of Dardanus, who built Troy. The third great-grandson of Dardanus was Aeneas, whose grandson was Brutus, who led a group to Britain to found New Troy, which is today called London. Well, there may be some truth to that, but there's no way to know how much. It would help us to know how fast the population grew. To determine this, I wrote a software program that allows me to set parameters. Since God commanded them to be fruitful and multiply, God would have also given them the ability to have many children. My grandparents had 10 children, so they could have easily had 10 children. Recent creationist writings point out that each generation accumulates mutations. Therefore, post-flood generations were genetically healthier than we are. So I'm going to be extremely optimistic and say they began having children at 15 and had a child every year. That's the opposite of what we do today. But both archaeology and the Bible attest that having lots of children was a high priority in the early days. Remember, this is flood-aware anthropology. Running the program, we reach a small population of 1,058 people 50 years after the flood. But then that rises quickly to 87,143 at the time of Babel. The tribes in the first 2 generations were small, but they were very different from one another and very intent on building strong families. They grew quickly into large settlements and nations. Genesis 9:20 says that Noah began to be a husbandman or a man of the soil, a farmer. There is no way to allegorize this into anything less than a farmer. Genesis 8:20 says that Noah sacrificed some of each of the clean animals and birds. That meant that he cared for the animals after they left the ark. Noah was a shepherd. Noah was not a caveman. Genesis 9:21 says that Noah lived in a tent. Noah probably used other kinds of containers than clay pottery since it was not popular in the center of the Fertile Crescent. Pottery is inconvenient for nomads. Noah was not a hunter because he had sheep, and wild animals were scarce and hard to find in the beginning. In 1986, John Osgood introduced a concept that he called the pond ripple effect. Visualize a rock falling into a pond and creating waves that travel out in all directions. He theorized that the faster and farther that tribes migrated away from the original center, the more they lost technical skills and the more primitive they appeared. We can use this to analyze settlement patterns. We would expect to find relatively advanced settlements in the center of the Fertile Crescent. As the first explorers went out in all directions, they would need to fish, to hunt, and to gather various foods that were growing wild. Some would be miners in the mountains, trying to strike it rich. The next wave would bring farming, and the next wave would bring pottery, and so on. It turns out that the pond ripple effect is a good way to explain what we find in archaeology. Cayonu is a farming community that is built on virgin soil. This close-up shows the nearby river and the stones that were used to construct 5 different types of buildings. These same architectural styles, called grilled, channeled, cobbled, cell, and large room, were repeated in settlements elsewhere. Excavation has shown careful architectural planning and consistent measurement with a cubit of 48 centimeters. Probably 100 or more people lived here in the end. They had fabric woven from flax and copper jewelry. They ate both emmer and einkorn wheat and raised sheep, aurochs, and pigs. Moving out, you can see that this location provided both stone for building and good soil for farming. The name given to this settlement type is pre-pottery Neolithic because it had farming but little or no pottery. Moving out again, we can see that Cayonu was on a bluff overlooking a fertile plain. Karakadag is 30 miles to the south. The Euphrates is only 25 miles to the west. The river on which Cayonu sits is a tributary of the Tigris River. Other settlements farther away, such as Kafir Hoyuk, started without farming and took up farming later. Pottery began in settlements that had clay, such as Halaf, 100 miles away, Hassuna, 200 miles away, and Samara, 360 miles away. Out of 15 aceramic sites near Cayonu, only 2 had later pottery levels. The other 13 were abandoned without ever using pottery. In this case, there is more archaeological evidence for separate cultures than for a transition from a widespread aceramic phase to a pottery phase. Gobekli Tepe was another Stone Age culture in this area, only without farming. 200 T-shaped pillars weighing up to 10 tons each were arranged in 20 circles. There were no houses, cemeteries, or altars. Carvings were mostly of animals, with some symbolic people. Each circle had 2 large pillars in the center, surrounded by about 10 smaller ones. No, it wasn't built by aliens. Although the stones were huge, Edward Banning estimates that it could have been built by 12 to 24 people in 4 months. In my opinion, it was a family gathering place, depicting a father and a mother in the center and children around them. It could have been covered with a sheepskin canopy like a circus tent for yearly celebrations. One article I read surmised that Stonehenge in England was used for that, as a yearly gathering place. That makes more sense to me than calling it some kind of weird superstitious temple. Gobekli Tepe was not the only megalithic site with large T-shaped pillars. These pillars have also been found northwest of it at Tilisik and Navali Kori, and east of it at Sefer Tepe. They have been found south of it at Hamzan and Karahan. These last two, along with Gobekli Tepe, all look down on the Balik River plain, where Abram lived with his father in Haran, and from which Rebekah and Rachel came. Although it's difficult to prove, this area could have been the venerated homeland of the nomadic Aramean culture, descendants of Shem, since this is where Abram went after he left Ur. The land of Aram was sometimes considered to stretch from Israel to Mesopotamia through the central part of the Fertile Crescent. Jacob was called a wandering Aramean in Deuteronomy 26:5. When we see 6 megalithic sites in the same region, we should conclude that they belong to the same tribe or tribes. So, 8 people grew to 1,000. They were grouped together into 50 significant families at the end of the second generation. Each tribe was intent on claiming its own land and developing it. Where did they go from the center of the Fertile Crescent? This map shows the drainage basins. K in the middle is Karakadag, where farming began. From Karakadag, water flowed west to the Euphrates River and east to the Tigris River. The Balik and Kabur drainage basins flowed south into the Euphrates. These rivers were like 4-lane highways that fanned out in all directions and made exploration of the region easy in the early years. As the population grew, tribes built both temporary and permanent settlements further and further away, almost always within the Fertile Crescent. Abram is famous for having traveled from Ur near the eastern extremity of the Fertile Crescent to Egypt beyond the western extremity of the Fertile Crescent. This is the land of the Bible. In the next part, we'll look at the tribes that went down into Canaan. I always thought that Canaan was rather insignificant next to the larger nations, like a flyover state. It was actually the first area selected for migration. Join us in part 3 to learn more about these settlements. In the meantime, I want to give you an assignment. I want you to read Genesis 8, 9, 10, and 11, especially if you haven't read them lately. These are the 4 chapters that deal with life after the flood and before Abraham. Try to find something that you've never noticed before. If you have learned anything about archaeology, then subscribe to this channel to learn more. The playlist Life After the Flood reconstructs a biblical model of life between Noah and Abraham. This is how archaeology works. It uses known facts to create a hypothetical scenario that is open to scrutiny. I have combined conservative hermeneutics with sound archaeology to create a model for biblical paleoarchaeology. You won't find such a clear and detailed study anywhere else. I promise to keep each video short. If you have learned something about the Bible as history and how God walks with mankind, then subscribe to this channel and tell others about it. I'm on a mission to educate everyone about the most ignored, misrepresented, and crucial period of human history. Join me by educating yourself and by telling others about life after the flood.